Hello, I'm Sophia, and welcome to What We Need to Know About Ukraine. Here, I learn about Ukrainian history, literature, and culture, and share my findings with you. Today, we will be talking about history, memory, and propaganda through the lens of the media. I am joined by Dr. Marta Dyczok, a historian, political scientist, and media scholar whose work has helped shape how we understand Ukraine's past and present. She is a professor at the University of Western Ontario in Canada and has worked extensively on how media influences our perception of history, memory, and identity. And she has a PhD from Oxford University. Welcome to the podcast. I'm very, very happy to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. That's the lovely introduction. I mean, you've covered all the bases. The only thing I would add is I've recently published my 7th book called Ukraine, Not the Ukraine, which just came out with Cambridge University Press in November, and it is now available open access. It's a brief history of Ukraine for people who are interested but don't have a huge amount of time. That's what you want to take a look at. And I'm also part of the Ukrainian program at the Monk School, which was set up many years ago. It's the Petroyatzik program for the study of contemporary Ukraine. And my first ever teaching job was at the University of Kiev-Mohyla Academy, and I remain an adjunct professor there.
Yes, and your book is fantastic overview of the full history of Ukraine. So it really does go from the very beginnings to present day, which is absolutely fantastic if you want something very continuous. But today, I really wanted to talk to you about media and memory and history, particularly thinking of your essay, A History, Memory, and the Media, which you wrote before before the Revolution of Dignity and all the invasions, but it has wonderful messages there. We could expand it today with what we know now and with how the media is working now, especially comparing it to how the media is working in Ukraine, how the media is working outside of Ukraine, relating it to history and seeing how do we make media that is effective both inside and outside of a country when you're trying to get to a goal.
That's such an interesting question, and thank you for looking at my previous research. It feels like a very long time ago. It's a project that I started and did quite a lot of research on, and then Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. So I put that project on hold and did other things, which I continued to be distracted by the war. But that, it's really at the heart of a lot of my research interests, and it sort of touches on a lot of the things that I continue to do. The starting point there is, how do we learn history? How do we know what happened in the past? Well, most of us are taught history when we go to school, and those of us who go to university sometimes continue studying it. But what happens after that, right? Because things change, and the Soviet Union fell apart. And a revised history of Ukraine was presented to people living in post-communist Ukraine. So how did they learn? Because they were no longer going to school. And also when communism collapsed, the world learned about Ukraine and other post-Soviet states in a new way. But again, adults were no longer going to school. So how do people learn about history when you're not a child or a student? And the short answer there is through media. And media here I'm using as the phrase for all kinds of media. So whether it is the professional legacy media or social media or online media, that's where we get most of our information, including our information about history. So when Russia's President Putin made that statement about Ukrainians and Russians historically being one people, how did we learn about that? Very few people actually went to his presidential website, but media outlets picked up on it and transmitted it, and that's how we learned. So that's what I'm looking at. That's what interests me, is how historical narratives are shaped on media, by journalists, how it's received by audiences, and what impact that has. So those questions haven't really changed with Russia's escalated war against Ukraine. What has changed is the media landscape, both within Ukraine and globally. And as you know, social media and online media are the main sources of information for people about politics, about sports, about culture, about history, about everything. And so that's what my new research project is on. But it's also tapping into some of the previous ideas from that project on media, memory, and history. Because the other thing that's interesting for me is the study of memory, which is quite an established field in academia. And what is conventional wisdom is the reason memory as a field of study is so interesting is because we remember things differently. This is something that historians have been looking at, but it's not just historians, people who study law. There are court cases where there is a traffic accident and there are 10 witnesses to the accident, and there will be 10 different reports on what actually happened. So it's not something that's specific to history. It's something that is very common, a human characteristic. We see different things. We remember different things. We remember things differently. And when we layer that onto history, what happens is the memories get distorted even further, because what happens in our minds is recent knowledge blends with old knowledge. So what we knew at the time that events were occurring is one thing, but we have subsequently learned more. And what happens is that more recent knowledge blends with the original memories. And I first encountered this when I was doing research for my doctorate, as you mentioned, at Oxford, which was about Ukrainian World War II refugees. I was doing my research in the 1980s, so there were still quite a few people who were alive who were refugees from the World War II period. They were elderly, but, most of them were very interested in sharing their memories. So I was collecting these interviews, and one gentleman I interviewed, Mr. Liman, who I interviewed in New York City, and he was at the time working at the UVAN, Ukrainska Vilna Akademia Nauk, Ukrainian Free Academy of Sciences. And these were primarily people from Eastern Ukraine who had migrated involuntarily, brought some archives with them, and they'd set up this archival repository in the Upper East Side on New York, on Manhattan. Fascinating place. I think it's still there. Anyway, so I was interviewing him, and he was describing how he was trying to avoid Soviet repatriation officials, because he was from Eastern Ukraine, and I'd have to look up my notes because this was a while ago, but I think he was from Luhansk, but I'd have to check that. In any event, he was from Eastern Ukraine, which is Soviet Ukraine, and what was in the Yalta secret protocols was an agreement on forcible exchange of populations by the Allied powers. So the Western governments agreed to hand over Soviet citizens by force, if necessary, back to the Soviet Union. However, only people who had Soviet citizenship in 1939. So all the people from non-Soviet Ukraine, so citizens of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, because that's all the western parts of Ukraine, they had been part of those states. They didn't have Soviet citizenship in 39, so they were not subject to forcible repatriation. This was what all those repatriation commissions were set up to investigate who was who and who was supposed to be sent back, etc. So there's a little bit of a historical detour there, but it's important because Mr. Liman from Eastern Ukraine was trying to avoid the Soviet Repatriation Commission. And he's telling me this, how he was hiding from these officials and moving around and so on. And I said to him, but how did you know that you were in danger? And he said, well, because there was this secret clause signed at the Yalta Agreement saying that Soviet citizens were liable to forcible repatriation. So I knew I had to avoid them. And I let it go and I let him keep speaking. But in my mind, what was happening is in the summer of 1945, he could not possibly have known, because the secret agreement at Yalta, which had been signed in February, did not become public knowledge until the 1980s. Secret agreement that only the signatories and the people who were implementing knew about. But it was not public knowledge, though there was no way he could have known. And yet afterwards, it became public knowledge and he learned about it. But he, in his head, incorporated the knowledge from the 80s to his experiences from the 40s. And I remember walking out of that interview thinking, what do I do with this? What do I do with this? Because clearly he believed that he knew. And the story he was telling was convincing. But what he must have, at the time, there was so much uncertainty. And I think it was just his gut instinct, having lived in the Soviet Union, that when the Soviet authorities are coming, you've got to run because you can't trust them. So it was probably his instinct that was working back in the 40s. But in his mind, he remembered it as the Yalta Secret Accord. So this is an example of how historical memory is problematic. The way people will remember things. I mean, you and I probably have had similar experiences. I've had experiences with friends of mine when we talk about something and they're like, no, that's not how it happened. I mean, you probably have had that experience as well.
I've had, even when it's something from when I'm really little, I can confuse it based on photographs I remember. So I think I remember it, but it's really just I've seen the photo. Yeah, that's very interesting. I think another aspect of it is when you don't really know what you remember. The example that you gave is the Chernobyl disaster.
Mm-hmm.
It's when you're very confused as to what is happening. You're fed right away various different types of information from state TV of what is happening versus what you're experiencing, but you're not 100% sure what it is. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like a traffic accident, right in front of you, so that you know this is what happened. And I guess it's also the perspective of you're just the one person seeing what you're seeing, so it's a little narrow and you're not seeing the bigger picture. So then when I guess historians are trying to put together this bigger picture, or even journalists at the time, it's very hard to understand why this person saw exactly what they saw and what they think is relevant to it.
Well, his journalists, they shape the historical narrative because, as you've just said, they're the ones that are choosing the information that's being presented and then disseminated. So they're shaping the narrative. And that happens all the time. I mean, media studies is full of this about agenda setting and framing and priming and all those theories that explain how media shapes the way we see things, but also how we remember things. And the very famous example in media studies is about the assassination of JFK, because that was reported by media. I mean, how many people were there? And how many people remember the event? It was a media event. And the Chernobyl example, which, I think I used in that article, a more recent example would be Russian warship, Go Yourself. That's something that was captured and transmitted. So we all remember it. Of course, we weren't there. So we remember it the way that journalists presented it to us.
Yeah.
And it becomes part of a collective memory, if you will, of sort of important events that occurred that we witnessed through media. Now, where it's changed and changing is the impact of social media, because we are now on information overload. So that dynamic of sort of collective memory being shaped by media is shifting, because we no longer have these big media outlets that are giving us the big stories. We're having, so many different media outlets that are providing us with visual images, with video images, with personal narratives and testimonials and witness and all that information. So it's a slightly different picture, but the legacy media still plays a really important role. And this is something that I'm still working on that in my head and in my research, that social media is the vehicle through which a lot of information is being transmitted, but a lot of the big stories are still coming through legacy media or professional media or conventional media. And the example that's in my mind right now is the funeral of the Pope. So there were photographs and video snippets that were all over social media, but the big narratives were coming from videos that were being posted on television stations. That example of Zelensky, when he walked in to the cathedral, that everybody started to clap, that was from a TV station. that captured that. But I saw it I can't remember which TV channel first broadcast it, but I saw it on social media. Somebody had posted a report of that TV channel that then became popular on others. And that's what media scholars call media convergence, where media, formats of media, they overlap. So you'll have video clips in the newspaper article and a TV report referencing a radio program and so on and so forth. So it's this convergence of media that I think is complicated to study, but I think that's where it's at right now.
I think there's a lot more misinformation with social media as well. And from what I witnessed, is there's also a lot more distrust now. Whenever I see media, I start to scrutinize where it's from, what are these people affiliated with. But obviously, a lot of the time, there's no time to do that. So how is that affecting how people remember things? Because at some point, I'll see a bunch of various titles and messages, and then I'll check some of them, and some of them I'll verify. And then in a week, if you ask me, I'll say, I've heard that. I just can't remember where
Mm.
and if I've verified it or not.
Well, the last thing you said, I can't remember where, that's not new. I mean, most people will not remember the source of the information. They'll remember the image, they'll remember the story, but they won't necessarily. So that part is not so worrisome. But the impact of social media on society and public opinion, that's a huge topic of study, and it's evolving. And it's very closely linked to issues of disinformation, misinformation, and polarization. Because what you also said is that you check the source. That's minority of the population will do that. Most people will just, if they read the news at all, they'll just read it and either accept it or reject it and move on. And they won't take the trouble to verify the accuracy. And that is precisely what people who are engaged in disinformation and misinformation, that's what they want. They want to spin the story and distort the story so that they can either get you to believe their lie or get you to not believe in anything. So those are the two goals of people who are specifically trying to, I mean, we see this in the American political scene, we see it in Canada, we see it internationally. I follow the Twitter feed of the Russian Foreign Ministry. You know, you would think they're amazing people. They're so kind and thoughtful. It's completely removed from reality. But, you know, they'll have an image of, you know, their foreign minister shaking hands with an African leader saying, you know, we're fighting against colonization and colonialism and imperialism. If you don't know any better, you might believe it. So social media has given platform to pretty much anybody. The thing not to overemphasize, though, is just because one has access to social media and anybody can post, that doesn't guarantee an audience. So if you look at how social media functions, we have these algorithms, and it takes quite a long time to develop a following, an audience. So just because you post something on whatever platform you're choosing, that doesn't mean you're reaching millions of people. It means that you've posted, but the audience part, that takes a while to develop. And that takes resources and money and so on. So it's not a black and white kind of a picture. And the role of influencers through social media is something that scholars are writing about. I teach a course on politics and media in the globalized world. I always ask my students, it's a fourth year seminar, you know, where they get their information, how they choose their sources. And of course, they all say social media. I ask them how they choose their sources. They don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about. It's either somebody suggested it or they stumble on it, or Taylor Swift is really popular, so they were following what she was saying about the American election. And they're pretty open about this. And it's the trend now is these people who are not, you know, they're not journalists, but they are making statements about politics. And, Someone like Taylor Swift, she's generally a positive person, but there are a lot of very destructive influencers. It's something I'm watching, although it's not my research focus, is what's happening in the United States media landscape. And Donald Trump is changing who has access to his press briefings and the White House. Reputable media outlets are being blocked. Bloggers with no verification are being allowed in because they're blogging pro-Trump messages. So that's changing sort of the source of information and the transmission part that's already second, but you need access to the source. And Zelensky, who is an extraordinary wartime president, he didn't like journalists before the war. He didn't give press conferences. He used social media to communicate with society. He had 1 or 2 press conferences, and that's it. And social media for politicians or any kind of actors, it's preferable because nobody asks you questions, right? Like, you could interrupt me at any moment and ask me a hard question. But if I was just, posting a video on social media, I could say what I want. Nobody can interrupt me or ask me hard questions. And that's what a lot of politicians want. They don't want the hard questions. Or they want people in the room that are going to give them the kinds of questions they want. So they want to shape the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also how you phrase your information is also really important.
Mm-hmm.
So even though eventually, I guess, other forms of media are going to get to the information that you put out, especially if you're head of state, you want that initial release to be formulated in the way that you want it to. And another interesting thing, I guess it's going back to algorithms, is an algorithm is going to feed you what you want. So if you're already trying to, I don't know, gear to one side, you're likely not ever going to see the other side on your feed, just because it's not good for social media to give you that, because they want you to keep scrolling. So I guess that's another interesting thing. But I also wanted to ask you about fiction and kind of the fictionalized world of it. For instance, movies or literature or music. The most obvious examples are the recent one of Russians at War, even though that's formatted more of as not fiction, but as a documentary, but also Soviet films. That are filled with propaganda, but they're filled with propaganda really lightly. So if you don't want to watch it as a propaganda film, you don't have to. You can just enjoy it as a comedy movie. But then, would you say that it kind of prepares the ground for more of actual propaganda? So then when something does happen, you're like, okay, this doesn't feel weird or wrong because I've encountered it somewhere else.
Well, yes. I mean, the purpose of this is to shape public opinion and to prime your audience to think in a certain way. So the way you portray people, events in cultural contexts will shape the way people perceive them when they see them in political context. Everybody engages in this. Everybody wants to present their vision of themselves and the historical record in a way that presents them in a positive light. Right? This is the purpose of propaganda. And propaganda it's not just about media. It's the soft power is as valuable as the hard power. And that's precisely what you've put your finger on, is it's through the arts. It's, through film, through song, through poetry, through novels. And it's very effective. And something that Bulgakov, in his novel The White Guard, where he writes about the period of the revolutionary period at the end of World War I in Kiev. But he writes about it from his perspective, which is, he was a white. He was a supporter of the Russian monarchy. And the way he depicts the Ukrainian independence movement in that novel is they're all dirty rabble-rousers and, hooligans. And somebody who reads that novel, and, that's all this person will ever read about Ukrainian national movement at that period, that's what's going to be left with him, right? they're going to be thinking that Ukrainian national movement is dirty rebel rousers and criminals, because that's what they read in this book. And that's why they do it, right? That's why, that's the purpose of presenting things in that way. And, particularly non-democratic regimes will spend a lot of effort on constructing this type of sort of soft propaganda. I mean, democratic countries do the same thing. If we look at Hollywood, or if we look at any production, the depiction of our societies is usually pretty positive. And I remember one thing my dad said. He lived through World War II. He's from Ukraine. He lived through World War II and lived in Canada for the latter part of his life. He didn't like watching American war movies because he said this is all propaganda. They portray Americans as heroes and strong and honorable. And he said they weren't like that. Some of them were like that, and some of them were cowards, and some of them were indifferent. And there was, like in any army, you'll have a variety of different personalities. But these American war movies, they're always the heroes. So, like you see it pretty much everywhere.
Going back to Zelensky, the question is how controlled should the media be? Obviously, during the war, it has to be controlled at some point. But then we get criticisms. I guess from your expert point of view, how do you, in this situation, control the media enough to really be able to achieve your goal, which I believe in this case is victory of Ukraine, also achieve support from the wider West and our allies, at the same time maintaining truth? I would say this is important when it comes to various political events in Ukraine, but also, for example, Ukraine's military losses and that type of stuff, things that are really difficult to talk about, and sometimes maybe harmful, but at the same time, you want to maintain this democratic outlook on life. I think it's just a very hard balancing act.
Well, another excellent question. The values of democracy don't change when war comes. So freedom of speech and all those issues, they don't disappear when difficult times appear. They have to be somewhat adjusted to balance with issues of safety and security. Overall, Ukraine, during this escalated war and during the entire war, actually, from 2014, has done a surprisingly good job in the area of freedom of speech. And there's something called the World Annual Press Freedom Index that Reporters Without Borders, they issue a ranking how each country is doing. And it's a very complicated process whereby they survey each country on a number of indicators, and then they issue their reports with statistics and also analysis. And freedom of speech in Ukraine has actually increased during conditions of war, which is really quite phenomenal if you think about it. And this is an article that I'm working on but haven't had a chance to finish yet. And journalists in Ukraine, what they say is that it's in the interests of national security for the state to provide society with maximum amount of information. Because very often the first casualty of war is the truth, right? That's a very famous saying. And that's not wrong. That is quite accurate, that very often states will contain information in the name of national interests. That has not been happening to a large degree in Ukraine. What has been happening is that state authorities have been limiting the release of information. So they don't talk about casualty rates. They don't lie about it, they just don't talk about it. And they also restrict access to war zones. And that also has been a controversial issue because some journalists, particularly journalists from outside of Ukraine, they want to go into the war zones. And Ukrainian authorities restrict them. and they restrict Ukrainian journalists as well. And there, the discussion is some journalists say we're being prevented from seeing what's really going on. And the state authorities and the military authorities are saying it is our responsibility to A, win this war, and B, make sure journalists don't get killed. So we can't let you into this zone because we can't guarantee your safety, and you're going to be interfering with our trying to win this battle. So you have to decide for yourself whether that is restricting freedom of speech. Technically, it is. But it's sort of like if there's an earthquake happening, you're sort of not letting somebody go into the center of the earthquake and saying, no, you have to stop here because your safety can't be guaranteed. So it's a fine point, but overall, the reporting from the front lines has been quite extensive, particularly Ukrainian journalists, but also non-Ukrainian journalists. So I don't believe that the criticism that they're being denied access is a strong one.
Absolutely. Mainly because medics and the press are not being treated as they should.
By the Russian side. The Ukrainian side is very
by the
respectful.
Russian side, so it's too dangerous to go. But let's turn to your book, Ukraine, Not the Ukraine. I think there's another very important part of this kind of who gets to shape the story in academia specifically, and where we're talking about history, because your book is titled Ukraine, Not the Ukraine. So already we have this kind of misconception. Is it Ukraine? Is it the Ukraine? And then further you look into Ukrainian history, especially in English publications, or even when a scholar is writing about Europe and then they mention Ukraine somewhere, there's a lot of misconceptions. These things were written or the knowledge was acquired during the Soviet Union. Like you said, it fell apart, more knowledge was gained, but these people did not go back to look specifically at Ukraine or even the Russian Empire. And I suppose the question is, what are these dominant narratives that were formulated that we still need to break apart?
Well, the writing of the history of Ukraine has been to a large degree by non-Ukrainians. Now, in and of itself, that's not a bad thing, but the main historical narratives were written by Russian imperial historians and transmitted into the English, French, German, Italian-speaking world. And this is when national histories and imperial histories were written. Ukraine did not exist as a state. And every nation, every empire writes its origin story, its history, and teaches its children, this is who we are, this is where we came from. And it's usually a glorious narrative, right? It's like we are strong, we are unique, and so on and so forth. Now, in the case of Russian history, when that was being written in the 19th century, Russia was an empire. And Ukraine was part of that empire. And Ukrainian historians did not have voice. So the Russian narrative of Kiev is the mother, the cradle of Russian civilization, that's the narrative that dominated. And for many people, that is still the mental map they carry around in their head because that's how they were taught history. And that's how any history book before, 2000, that's the narrative. It's Kiev and Russia. And Russian history is taught by starting with Kiev and Russia and then going through. And even people that I work with at my university, I'm still explaining to them because that's how they were taught history. And the parallel that I often use is when I was going to school, I'm much older than you, the way I was taught Canadian history is these Europeans crossed the ocean, these adventurers, these explorers, and they found this land and they brought civilization and they taught the natives about civilization and they built this great country called Canada. That was the narrative when I went to school. No, today, nobody teaches Canadian history like that because that is the colonial narrative. Because what actually happened is, I mean, the facts are true. The Europeans crossed the ocean and they came here, but there were people living here. And they conquered them and they stole their land and they put them in reservations and took over. And they continue to oppress them to this very day. So that's the shift in the historical narrative that's happened in Canada is just slowly happening regarding Ukraine and Belarus and all the other parts of the former Russian Empire. And something that is a little beyond my capacity but needs to happen, and some people are working on this, is today the narrative that Russia is fighting against Ukraine. A lot of people who are being conscripted into the Russian army are not ethnic Russians. They are Buryats and Ingushes and Chechens and other people who were colonized by Russia and continue to be in a colonial relationship with the Russian Federation, being used to kill Ukrainians and being called Russians. So that needs to be decolonized in the narrative. And that's something that somebody else has to do that part. But that is also, I mean, for somebody who doesn't know very much about his history or politics or Russia, they're not familiar with the fact that there are 100 different ethnic national groups living within the Russian Federation that are not Russians, but they're all called Russians. So that really does need to change.
How would you call Russia's war against Ukraine? Because a lot of the time it's in the media, to shorten it, I guess, Ukraine's war or Ukraine conflict. And I think we're forgetting that the big part of that is the Russian Federation. What do you think is the best way for media to actually call this war without seeming a little skewed and forgetting the other part of it?
Again, that's a really important point, and something that I'm also working on an article about is words matter. The way we label things shapes the perception of what it is. So if there's a headline, "The Ukraine War," it sounds like Ukraine's making a war. But in fact, it is Russia's war against Ukraine. Russia's war against Ukraine, that's 4 words. Ukraine war, 2 words. So that's why journalists will go for shorthand, because they need to fit a headline. So I think the shortest possible is Russo-Ukraine war. So that's 2 words. That's a hyphenated word and war, but that captures the Russo-Ukraine war.
Is there anything else that you want to talk about that I didn't ask?
Well, something that I would like to draw attention to is that I've said this in other interviews. One of the positive outcomes of this horrific Russian war against Ukraine is that today more people in the world know more about Ukraine and its history and its culture and its music and its people and its geography than ever before in history. And that is because we do have the whole academic machine. And this is a war that's being fought in real time. We are watching everything in real time. And when people in Ukraine have voice to say we are Ukrainians, that is something that is no longer going through a Russian filter. That is going directly to audiences. And that is changing the way people are seeing this. And I'm seeing it in my teaching. I mean, the student interest in this is phenomenal. Ukrainian studies had traditionally been a bit of a specialty topic, but now there's an explosion of interest. I designed this course, Russia's War Against Ukraine. I had 1,000 students and a waiting list. So the interest is there. And I think that's a huge positive that people are learning, and that the narrative, this is all Russia and Ukraine is just part of Russia, that narrative is weakening. I think a lot more people are seeing it not in the old imperial way, but in the real way that Ukraine is a separate group of people. And the war has been instrumental in that. So that's a positive.
so much for joining me today, and this was What We Need to Know About Ukraine this week.